So, a few words about the consortium. Many of you may be familiar with us, but for those who aren't, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is a regional fire science exchange. It's sponsored by the Joint Fire Science Program. And we cover Oregon and Washington, as you can see in the map, with the exception of Southeast Oregon in the Great Basin. The mission of the consortium is to accelerate awareness, understanding, and application of wildland fire science. And we work to offer a venue for two-way communication. And so we hope in all of our offerings, including this webinar today, that to both share new information as well as hear from you all at the end with your questions and needs at the end of today's presentation. We have a variety of venues and formats that we use to share science, and from documents from syntheses and research briefs to field tours, webinars like this, workshops. And we also have a monthly newsletter, and we'll put a chat to both our website. You can learn more about us, as well as a link to join that monthly newsletter where we recap all the science that has come out in the last month in the chat shortly. So today's webinar and this series are intended to create space for new thinking and conversation about how we most effectively recover from wildfire events and address resilience. We have asked the teams of scientists and managers to provide short presentations highlighting different dimensions of this and to leave time for discussion and Q&A. We have also asked our presenters, and we also ask you to consider a trauma-informed approach in how we engage today. This means that we're taking care with images, words, and tone that we use to maintain an environment that considers the safety and well-being of everyone here and anyone who may have experienced fire or smoke in some way. Please help us maintain this environment by being respectful in your own words and tone when you ask questions or provide comments, and take care of yourself by stepping away if you need to. We'll put a link for more information about OSU Extension's Trauma Informed Toolkit in the link. And just before we begin, I'll stress again the importance of taking that survey. I'll put it in the chat shortly. And thank you. I'm going to hand the mic over to Colin from Washington State DNR, and he's going to introduce today's topics and the speakers.
All right. Thanks, Autumn. Super excited to be coming to you all from a remote location here in Roslyn, Washington. I'm new to Roslyn. I'm new to Washington. I'm new to sort of the whole post-fire sort of program management. But I've dabbled in it like so many of you over the years. And so now we're actually being able to have positions that are fully funded to do nothing but post-fire. And I'm fortunate to be in one of those spots with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. This is a great webinar because I am far from my desk right now on an awesome field trip looking at a post-fire site. But we're also bringing in Phoebe, who's from New Mexico, and is a longtime resident of Washington, but now her scope has come out to a national context. So it's really exciting to be able to use the power of this technology, the sort of familiarity we all have with Zoom, even though it can be a pain to bring these things. So great thanks to the Fire Science Consortium for helping us kind of come together. Patrick and Autumn and EJ really did a lot of this work to make sure that this is successful. This topic is really interesting to me because I see it as being at the intersection of so many different things, which is why post-fire is an intellectually exciting and stimulating kind of place to be from both a science and a practice standpoint. The intersection here that we're going to talk about is the intersection of where the watersheds and the green infrastructure and the natural component of our landscapes interact and intersect with the built infrastructure. Phoebe, who I'll let introduce herself in more detail, but Phoebe and I work together in New Mexico, actually on the practice of doing some of this work. And Phoebe has a lot of experience and brings a lot of practical knowledge and science knowledge to how do we prepare for and recover from some of these disasters so that we can actually come back in a stronger, more resilient standpoint from a community and a watershed and a natural resources kind of management. Annie is going to talk to us about the intersection of how all of that comes together in policy and in a policy framework. Her colleague Tyson is on standing by, for tech support and any additional things. But Annie and Tyson are working together. And again, I'll let them introduce themselves in more detail. But on how do we bring that together in a policy framework? We talk about um, holistic management and watershed scale and landscape scale, and sometimes that still gets compartmentalized into the forests and the green stuff, and then the built stuff and the gray stuff. And I think the great work that both Phoebe and Annie are doing in two different fields is helping to integrate those things together. So with that, let me introduce Phoebe, who will talk first, and then Annie, who will talk first, and maybe Phoebe, you can introduce yourself, and then Annie, when it gets to your point, you can introduce yourself in a little more detail. Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Colin, for that introduction. And great to be here with Annie and Colin. Colin and I were watching floods here in New Mexico after the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fires, and just a wonderful colleague and great to also learn from him and others. So just welcome to everybody. I'm here in New Mexico along the banks of the Middle Rio Grande. Been doing post-wildfire pretty much my entire career, came out of grad school and worked for Los Alamos National Laboratory after at the time, one of the biggest wildfires here in New Mexico called the Cerro Grande fire. And it was in the East Jemez Mountain region in 2000 and devastated the landscape, but also threatened one of our national laboratories, Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so I was humbled and honored to be a part of the post-fire recovery for the laboratory, mitigating the impacts of post-wildfire flooding on critical facilities and national security buildings and infrastructure across over a dozen watersheds throughout Los Alamos National Laboratory footprint. So that's where I really cut my teeth on and beginning to jump in the deep end, literally trying to navigate post-wildfire flooding. And so since then, since 2001, been working in this area, also helping local tribal Pueblo communities manage manage the impacts of the catastrophic fire itself, but also the impacts to infrastructure, and really looking at resilient solutions as we are getting hit more and more, it seems like on an annual basis, with catastrophic wildfires here in New Mexico in particular. And also want to acknowledge what I've learned is each region, each state, each basically ecosystem is very different. Our weather systems are also very different depending on where we are in the United States, where we are in the state of New Mexico, and where we are within a particular watershed. So I've been humbled to work with a number of different entities throughout my career, from DOE, the Department of Energy, National Laboratory, to local small community pueblos and governments that may not have the breadth of technical resources and expertise and capacity and capabilities as a national laboratory does, like Los Alamos, and really looking at navigating those resilient long-term mitigation measures as we continue to enter into and see and experience very much uncertainty within our climate and in our respective environments. So with that, I will start sharing my screen here and really jump into one of the, let me share my screen first, and then I can see if you can all see that. Can. Okay. There you go. Can you all see that? Thumbs
Looks
up.
good, Phoebe. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. So just did a very high level title here. I want to start back in not in the Cerro Grande fire, but in our Las Conchas fire, which had started in June 2011. And at the time, again, 11 years before that, there was the Cerro Grande in this landscape as well. But then we had the Las Conchas fire, which moved tremendously fast that first day of over 40,000 acres across this very heavily forested landscape here in New Mexico along the East Jemez Mountain region. It's a mountain in a desert region in a very arid climate. But we had a lot of pines, a lot of Doug fir, a lot of different coniferous forest in this particular area. And so for it to move 40,000 acres that first day, and I actually was down watershed when I saw that little plume of smoke on a Sunday afternoon, and to come the next morning back into the area and to see the whole valley just inundated with smoke. And I appreciate some of the comments that Autumn had earlier about, the trauma and the devastation that these forest fires have on our communities and within our environment as well, acknowledging all the animals too that have been devastated by, in this example, a wildfire that moves so quickly through the landscape. And I want to say, from that first Sunday afternoon and then that early morning on Monday, hearing on the radio that the fire was estimated at 40,000 acres, I was thinking to myself as I was driving up to my office up at Los Alamos, which I have to go all the way around from Cochiti to Los Alamos. It's about an hour and a half drive. And listening to the radio, and I kept saying, man, I think they're off by a magnitude. How can it have moved 40,000 acres in less than 24 hours? How could it do that? Like, I just couldn't get my head around that. But as I got to the laboratory and looking at the cameras, they have some cameras on top of the ski area on top of one of the mountain peaks around Los Alamos, and looking at a map and saying, I know where the fire started, and oh my gosh, there is no, it's not a mistake that it did move 40,000 acres that first day. And so we had our with the fire moving that quickly, it was a basically wiping of the landscape. In particular, Cochiti Canyon and Peralta Canyon, that are just in the backyard of my pueblo of Cochiti's land base. It completely devastated the landscape. When I went up into the watershed after it was safe in July, it looked like a moonscape. There was, toothpicks. You couldn't see the root ball holes, but I could see even some deer that had broken legs because they were, walking on the landscape and fell into a root ball and broke their leg. It was a very just mind-blowing experience to be in these watersheds after that fire. So for all the work I did at Los Alamos and being firsthand, seeing all the flooding after Cerro Grande across over a dozen watersheds, we had implemented a number of different measures. And by 18 to 2 years after working on that project at the lab, I ended up inheriting trying to implement the entire flood mitigation project. So I learned a lot across multiple watersheds of what works, what didn't work, hard infrastructure, looking at watershed-wide implementation of mitigation measures. It really was enlightening to me and just an extension of my learning of what works after these catastrophic fires. Again, each watershed is unique, each climate is unique, each area is unique, and even each precipitation event is unique within those particular watersheds, because a watershed can react differently to a precipitation event if it rained before, the day before, or a whole week before. And so what happened during the preceding precipitation events also impact what happens on subsequent events. So I always like to say that it's a science, but it's also a very uncertain science, because we're always having to determine what the current status is and what the impacts are from the fire, as well as the preceding days or precipitation events. So for this particular watershed, I just want to ground us in this catastrophic Las Conchas event that we had. And so because of that, in this is what it looked in the watershed after. This is Cochiti Canyon in the upper portions. Hydrophobic soil we had, for in the landscape for acres and acres, very extreme elevation changes. It's a series of mountains, canyons, mesa tops. And so when we have hydrophobic soil and just extreme elevation changes, it's a recipe for really extreme post-wildfire flooding on normal monsoonal annual rainfall events. And so I want to focus in on another canyon that was impacted. That's Peralta. And that's just downstream of, or down south of where that previous photo was. But in this instance, we see the footprint of Peralta, again, half burnt in that, but we saw extreme flooding even all the way down to the funnel point before it enters the river. And so for this particular canyon, and it's hard to kind of see here, I don't know if you see my pointer, but this watershed, our entire pueblo of Cochiti is at the base of this watershed. So whatever flood comes or flow comes out of the upper portion, it was coming directly, squarely toward our pueblo of Cochiti. And so some of our estimates that we were seeing, flow 2D analysis with the burn scar, this is what that intersection would have looked like without mitigation in the watershed. We had a series of two 10-foot culverts here. There was a location here where where the current flow line of the watershed comes before it goes into our main river of the Rio Grande. But our entire village would have been inundated had we not done anything. And so what we ended up implementing in the Las Conchas was as extensively as we could watershed mitigation measures, which it was a series of grade control points. We utilized existing features in the landscape, like these berms that were already in place. The other thing about this area is highly and culturally sensitive areas. So there was some NEPA considerations we had to navigate, culturally sensitive areas where we couldn't necessarily impact or disturb. So it was really just utilizing the features of the landscape and existing infrastructure. So you see this road that comes, we call it Tribal Road 92, and it goes up into this particular watershed. And I'm noting all these features because as we use this infrastructure and these features in the landscape, we were able to mitigate post-wildfire flooding, so that when we did have a major event in 2013, and even between 2011 and 2013, we were able to mitigate and encourage the flow, so that in fact this is what happened, where we were able to, even on 100, this is an example of what could happen. So we, as I said, utilize these features in the landscape and encourage the flow to this main line here, flow line, and around the pueblo. And the biggest thing that we had to do was actually remove constriction points in the flow line. So water is very powerful. It's going to do what it wants to do, especially in a high flow event. And so the two 10-foot culverts back of the envelope had about a 2,600 cubic feet per second capacity. And so back of the envelope, we were looking at maybe 9,000 cubic feet per second on a 10-year annual event, precipitation in the upper watershed. And in fact, we did in fact see about 9,000 cubic feet coming out of this watershed. So two 10-foot culverts wouldn't do it for us. And the concern here is if you constrict the flow here, the next flow line would have been through the path of least resistance for the water would have been right through our main village. And you can see here, there's an old flow line right through here. And that was the historical flow line of Peralta. As we know, when we have dynamic watersheds, it will want to evolve back to historical channel flow lines. So the concern was like, now our village have been built and housing have been built into this historical flow line. So we had to continue to encourage the flow line here. And why I bring all this up is because we did see this coming toward the village where we saw a lot of sediment to that Peralta crossing that 2 10-foot culvert area. We saw the road being inundated. We saw heavy flooding coming across. And then we also saw extreme erosion on our infrastructure. And so I want to get to that. So we saw extreme embankment cuts, roads being inundated. But why that is important is because if we don't take care of the flow lines where the water is going to flow, it is not going to be able to it's going to find the path of least resistance, which might be toward built infrastructure or homes. So what we ended up doing was we installed on that embankment, we installed some concrete cable mats and did some low-tech soil stabilizer and then reseeded it. And what's interesting is even after the Cerro Pelado fire in 2022, almost a decade later, the infrastructure that we put in place is still holding up. And it is a combination of natural infrastructure with the hard concrete infrastructure. And we see this and we experience this in a number of other locations with the watershed. And I know I could get talking about this all day long. But the other critical point was that road crossing and that bridge crossing where there was 2 10-foot culverts. You can see it in this picture here. We opened it up because I knew that the capacity here was not going to be sufficient in order to allow that amount of projected water to come down. We opened it up so that it could convey around 10,000 cubic feet per second. And so today we have a bridge. And in addition to the bridge, this was a picture of the 2 10-foot culverts operating where we then down cut about 18 feet in that watershed because of the acceleration of the energy coming out of the culverts. And these gabions were completely undermined. So again, with the combination of hard infrastructure with replacing the gabions, we also did reseeding and we applied a soil stabilizer on the entire floodplain because you can barely see it, but we have a lagoon on the other side. So there was a siphon underneath, and that siphon was almost exposed, then potentially contaminating the Rio Grande River, which is one of the major rivers that our state depends upon. So as these videos or these pictures show that it was able to withstand over 5,000, 9,000 cubic feet per second without degrading. And so we saw this type of flow after Cerro Pelado as well. But 10 years later, it is still holding up. And in fact, we got a lot of vegetative growth back on the landscape. It's not down cutting. The combination of hard and natural mitigation measures also created a grade point, so we don't have the channelization in the watershed. And this combination is enabling the watershed to mitigate major increase of energy and flow and erosion within the watershed because we have those hard points now in the entire watershed. So with this example that we had at Cochiti, to implement, we put looked at as far high in the watershed as we could get. And the pictures over a year later of what we've implemented demonstrate that it can be successful. Even today, we still see water coming down this area in a high velocity, and we're seeing that stabilization in the watershed. And I know I want to give time for Annie to do her presentation, but I just wanted to share this. And we're going to continue to see that magnitude or more of increase of flow because of these catastrophic wildfires. So when we look at existing large culverts or existing bridges, and then we have a magnitude or more, even when we look at our Department of Transportation state manuals and design criteria for infrastructure, how can we look at like this example, 2,000 cubic feet per second, and then having to design to now a magnitude greater and looking at the footprint of what that structure would look like, the cost. And with this approach, we're able to also work with the watershed with natural mitigation measures and encouraging that growth and that stabilization. Because the other part of this is that in order not to impede the watershed, to soak in that water when it does rain and then provide a perennial flow or slower flow to our main rivers, that's also important for water quantity and water quality downstream of these catastrophic wildfires. So with that, Colin, I'll turn it back over to you and Annie for the next presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Phoebe. I think in a short amount of time, there's so much, it's so hard to cover all of the stuff, and there's so many big stories underneath that big story that are really important to tell. And just to really emphasize, it was the wildfire that triggered the event, but it was the changes to the infrastructure that saved the village, and continue to sort of serve that village with flood control and water quality. So with that, yeah, let's go ahead and transition. Annie, go ahead and take it away when you're ready.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Phoebe. It's really a pleasure to be presenting today alongside Phoebe and the great work she's done. Had an opportunity to see it firsthand in New Mexico last year. It was pretty fantastic. So I'm glad to be here with all of you today. My name is Annie Schmidt. I'm one of the two managing directors for the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience. I'll note that my counterpart and colleague Tyson Bertoni-Riggs is also here today. If there are questions that pertain to his area of expertise, or if tech issues crop up, you'll be hearing from him. I'll note, though, that in addition to working for the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience, my background is really in community-based wildfire resilience. Over a decade ago, I started working on post-fire issues in my own community as a result of wildfires there, and have had a chance to experience some of the challenges and opportunities related to post-fire as a ground-based practitioner, as well now as being able to see this from a national perspective and the policy space. So with that note, I'll just say that the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience was established this April to really encourage the adoption of wildfire commission recommendations into law and policy. We'll talk a little bit about what the commission is in a second, but my job really focuses now on fostering the connections and partnerships and relationships necessary to really advance changes in national wildfire policy. And in part, those changes include changes to our post-fire policy. So let's talk a little bit about the policy landscape. And I know this is a little bit of a departure from the typical framing of landscape resiliency or even community resiliency, but let's talk about policy for just a second. So we have seen, to take the 30,000-foot view, some trend lines that are escalating. And we're not going to spend time reading these in great detail, but I think it's enough to say that we're seeing an increase in structure loss, we're seeing an increase in acres burned, both in forests and in rangelands. We are seeing escalating costs for wildfire response, and we know that those costs are only a fraction of what we're actually spending when it comes to the costs and losses related to wildland fire. All of these trend lines can be sort of summed up, right? Escalating costs and losses, widening impacts from fire. We're seeing impacts to our natural infrastructure. We're seeing impacts to our built infrastructure. This can be smoke related. It can be our drinking water. It can be drinking water availability, in addition to home loss, in addition to forest and rangeland impacts. And we're also seeing wildfires impact geographies that have been considered outside the norm at this point. It's in the context of all of these sort of escalating trends that Congress established the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law in November of 2021. Sometimes it's referred to as bill or the bipartisan infrastructure law. That really created a group of 50 members from diverse backgrounds, really different areas of expertise, skills, and experiences, and tasked them with making recommendations to Congress to better mitigate and manage wildland fire. And Congress was pretty sweeping in its direction to the commission. Some things were specific, some things were much more general. When it came to post-fire, there was really only one line that talked about the rehabilitation of land devastated by wildland fire. I'll note that those 50 members from diverse geographies and backgrounds, when first they met in September of 2022, evaluated that single line in the statute to be largely inadequate. They had more to say about post-fire than just landscape rehabilitation. They saw post-fire as much more complex than that and saw the necessary policy changes, which we'll be talking about, as more expansive. As a result, they focused an entire work group on post-fire impacts, both in the natural and built environment. So this commission was given this 1 year to issue a report to Congress. They did that. They came to complete consensus. That means that those 50 people agreed on 167 recommendations. That is a lot of people to agree on any one thing, let alone 167 things. And it was an incredibly challenging process. But in coming to agreement, I think what we see is that there is a lot of opportunity to make progress on policy that is widely supported from diverse participants that can withstand what was fundamentally a political exercise and also highlights what is essentially possible from a legislative perspective. So as the commission did their work, as they dived into making recommendations to Congress on how to better mitigate and manage wildland fire, and that includes post-fire impacts and needs and recovery, they found a couple of pretty critical things. One is that trajectory we talked about matters, and that our existing system of policies and sort of the policy landscape itself is inadequate to address both where we are now and where we will be in time as that trajectory continues. So the ability to continue the status quo with what we're doing now from a policy perspective, the commission found to be infeasible and unwise. In order to shift that trajectory, they really wanted to see us start to reframe how we think about wildfire, that it is fundamentally an issue about more than land management. We're seeing conflagrations in the built environment. We see a need to reduce risks across multiple impact areas, including public health, including evacuation. We want to be talking about post-fire impacts and more. In order to do this, we have to broaden the partners and voices at the table. That includes folks like the public health community, the insurance industry, non-forested landscapes, and more. right? It also includes discussion of the workforce in both mitigation and in recovery. We have to start looking at wildfire in a much more broad and complicated, complex way. And in doing so, that opens up a whole new solution set, new opportunities in Congress, new alliances, opportunities for integrated approaches. I think we heard Phoebe talking about this, right? That we need to look at how we bring together the built and the natural environments, how we do both nature-based solutions and rely on some of this hard infrastructure to start to get to effective solutions. I think you can apply that same sort of bringing together of component parts to the policy landscape as a whole. I'm not going to dwell on all of what the commission had to say. We just don't have time for it. We will drop a link into the chat to the commission report, which you can read if you'd like. But I want to spend some time talking about the commission's need they identified to shift to proactive action, and really what they saw as a fundamental opportunity to recover with more resilience. The commission saw that recovery was largely, in their own words, an opportune and critical time to make investments that go beyond simply restoring baseline conditions, but to also improve overall resilience of both communities and landscapes. Right? Recovery as an opportunity to recover ahead, to bounce forward, to get to a set of conditions that are fundamentally more resilient to future impacts. In the post-fire context, they recognize that this is a complicated space to be operating in. We really do need to be looking at sort of the confluence of features in both the built and natural environments. It involves multiple federal agencies. GAO has issued a couple of reports that use the word fragmented in multiple places, that there is a current fragmentation of the policy landscape when it comes to wildfire recovery. We also know that wildfire recovery and the post-fire period can really exacerbate existing inequities inside of our communities, and that the policy infrastructure that we have is to use a phrase Colin used the other day when we were talking about this, undersized in some ways. It's set up for reaction. It's not set up to take proactive approaches that then minimize future harm. It's set up to sort of react and bring things back to baseline. So the commission recognized that this was an opportunity to make some recommendations back to Congress for a roadmap and a solution set for necessary congressional action, and really saw recovery as an opportunity to build resilience. In doing so, they made 23 recommendations in the post-fire space. These recommendations for congressional action include recommendations to improve overall resilience. So what are the organizational and financial structures that underpin existing fragmented policy landscape? They made recommendations regarding the speed of funds, recognizing that risk in a post-fire environment is relatively immediate, and yet many of our federal programs take some time. They wanted to talk about and made recommendations regarding what actions are eligible for funding and how we make more post-fire activities eligible for that. And then they also recognize that wildfire can create conditions that proliferate additional hazards. And they called it cascading events, where you have a fire and then you get a flood, and then you get another flood, and then you get another flood, and then you get a flood after that. And our existing policy infrastructure is really sized to deal with that initial wildfire. It's not necessarily sized to deal with the successive and repeated cascading impacts that come. The commission also made recommendations regarding planning, better planning for post-fire. How do we take a look at our landscape and see the post-fire hazards before we've had a fire and take action to be more proactive at that time, as well as how we recover in the built environment, what happens to housing and housing capacity, housing stocks. They made a number of recommendations related to recovery in the natural environment, including the need for cross-jurisdictional assessment of burned areas, the need for rain gauges to help us monitor flows and provide notification, critical time-sensitive notification to communities in the event of post-fire hazards. They made some recommendations related to seed capacity, as well as some emerging best practices and administrative actions that can be taken in the post-fire space. The commission didn't stop there. There's a ton of related recommendations, 167 in total between two reports, the aviation report and the final report. Not going to dwell on these, but would just simply point out that if you go to the commission report and you only read the chapter on post-fire, you're missing out. There's some really great and related recommendations to post-fire in the science, data, and technology chapter related to post-fire research and monitoring, as well as in some of the funding and investment chapters. I'll also point out that the commission had a lot to say about accessibility and how important it was that funds be accessible, particularly for communities who may not have the capacity initially to go after some of these large federal programs. So where are we with all of this and the post-fire recommendations in particular? Right now, approximately 50% of the commission's recommendations have been incorporated into either released legislative text or are in draft legislative text. So Congress is paying attention. They got this report. They asked for it in the bipartisan infrastructure law. The commission produced it. It's gone back to Congress. And now Congress is doing their work, right? With 50% of the recommendations in draft and released legislative text, it's a pretty good milestone for the commission at 1 year post-report delivery. The House recently passed its first commission-related legislation. The Senate remains a bit of an open question, and we know that there is a markup in Senate Energy and Natural Resources in November with close to 80 different bills, and so we'll see what that ultimately coalesces into becoming. With respect to the post-fire recommendations, I'll note that this same confluence of factors that make post-fire and the post-fire environment very challenging also make policy pretty challenging. The commission vision of what could be in post-fire was fairly expansive, but the uptake of those recommendations have been variable, and it's been sort of challenged by the different jurisdictions of Congress. For example, a lot of the natural environment items come through the Natural Resources Committees, whether in the House or Senate Energy and Natural Resources on the Senate side, but we also know that there's a lot of really critical work that has to be done in the built environment, and that comes through a whole different set of committees. And so some of those jurisdictional lines in Congress are as challenging as the jurisdictional boundaries that we find on the landscapes we're working in a lot of the time. So some elements, though, of the recommendations have really enjoyed a fair bit of traction. Others have lagged behind. We'll kind of walk through some of those really fairly briefly. I would say that the overall resilience recommendations of the commission have been fairly charismatic in a post-fire sense. How fast funds are making their way to the ground, what are the eligible actions for funding, and cascading events. We've actually seen two different approaches to dealing with some of the cascading events issues. We haven't seen as much uptake in the recovery in the built environment with when it comes to things like housing stock and local capacity, nor have we seen the same type of uptake when it comes to some of that planning for post-fire. We've seen mixed reaction to recovery in the natural environment with rumors of adjustments to the EWP program and some additional authorizations in the Farm Bill. We'll see what that ultimately looks like. We have seen pretty good uptake on seed capacity, and also we know that the administration is taking some action on emerging best practices and administrative actions. Science, data, and technology remains a fairly charismatic recommendation of the commission, and we see uptake there too. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of note that there are some recent bills that have come out. I'm going to flash them up on the screen. you want more information about this, go ahead and drop any questions into the chat. But really want to get to this last bit to note that there is an active and ongoing community, I would say, working on post-fire work, whether it's an interagency coordination, governance, practitioner to practitioner support, webinars like this one, policy development efforts, advocacy. The post-fire community is mobilizing to deal with many of the challenges that we've seen in place for years, and that I think we are starting to have a good feel for what actions are necessary, at least at the congressional level, to start to mitigate the impacts that folks have been experiencing. So with that, what can you do sort of comes down to recognizing post-fire as an opportunity. It is a challenging one, but there is an opportunity here. The Commission can help provide a roadmap and source for policy solutions. We'd invite you to use it. Feel free to share that report with partners and decision makers. And then also, I know sometimes it's tempting to sort of ignore the policy landscape because it feels dysfunctional and can feel challenging. That's not to say nothing will happen. And if we assume that nothing will happen, then nothing will happen. So this is really an opportunity to use your voice to encourage action. And we think that the Commission report provides a good roadmap for the next couple of years. And we'd really invite folks to share it and to join in the effort to start to sort of resize our policy to fit the conditions we know we're experiencing on the ground. Just like the culverts need to be sized up during the post-fire period to deal with increased flow, we need to size up our policy as well to be a little bit more proactive in our approach. Thanks. I think we've left some time for questions.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Annie. I think it's important too, just to remember, as we think about how the science informs the policy and the timeline of when those policies get implemented, they're often punctuated by major fires somewhere in the country or major post-fire events. And so not only is it important, to engage as scientists and managers, important to engage with the policy front and be thinking about creative solutions. When those opportunities are present, it's really important to do that in between those moments, so that when the momentum is there, when people are fired up on Capitol Hill or in the legislative offices in our states, that we're ready to go with good solutions, because there will be a solution, and it may not be the one that we want if we're not in the conversations and in those things during the meantime. So hopefully, these two really excellent presentations have generated some questions, and hopefully, Autumn, you can help me go through those. We do have some time. I do want to just, acknowledge one of the common threads between the two is just the creativity that it takes to go outside of sort of the normal world that we're working in, and kind of go to the different offices, go to the different committee rooms, talk to the different people, bring in all those different ideas to try to find the common solution. That should feel pretty comfortable with a lot of our interdisciplinary science that we're engaged in, the management complexities that we have, all of those different things those skills that we develop are transferable to this post-fire landscape. So super interested in hearing from the group here if there's any questions.
There's currently none in the Q&A box right now.
Okay.
I have a quick question though. Hopefully it's not too controversial, but I'm just curious about, how much you hear about and how much it affects your work, both in preparing these things and then the potential implications of them, of the polarization that we often hear about in anything that has to do with federal policy these days.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I would say that Wildfire has long enjoyed a relatively nonpartisan position in our discussion space. And I'll just point out that, and I said it, I think earlier in the presentation, that 50 people is a lot of people, right? That is a huge number of people to get to agree on anything. mean, I think about my Thanksgiving table and what that's going to look like, and getting just that table to agree on one thing, let alone 167 things, is pretty rough. Those 50 people also, that's half of a Senate. And they got to agreement on 167 things. So I think what that tells us is that there is a lot of ground to be gained in our approaches to wildfire, and that it does not have to be a polarized or partisan issue, that there are ways to get to agreement. At the end of the day, everybody wants to serve their community well. And I think that that's what we found with commission members. They want to serve their country and their communities well, and to come up with the ideas and the solutions, many of which aren't necessarily groundbreaking, but are things that the larger community has been advocating for years, and they just simply lifted them up in a consensus way. And so it doesn't have to be, is my answer to that. It just doesn't have to be.
One of the unifying things that we see unifiers is water and water quality. And so Phoebe, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the work that you've been doing to help support other communities with their water infrastructure for that quality and quantity.
Thank you, Colin. And to what Annie was saying too is, working in blue, red, purple areas, in the end, really, I think even where it could be very polarizing, once that adage of sitting at the kitchen table, I've sat across the table with, depending on their political backgrounds, because you'll have those unifiers and those topics of like water. Everyone needs clean drinking water. Everyone wants good water, even in our streams and rivers. We don't want to see yellow rivers coming down or and so forth. So I think those topics to ground ourselves in, where we can get away from polarized discussions and really on the ground talking with folks, and even on the infrastructure, because we're also talking about the funding, right? The funding for critical infrastructure. But also once you start tying and making the connections between, say, even green infrastructure, meaning taking care of the land, taking care of the mountains, making sure we have sustainable forests, because those are our water sinks. Those are our sponges in our upper watersheds, where, I think also in terms of the possibilities of, I guess, uplifting that talk and making those connections is really important. So in fact, tomorrow there's going to be a big water meeting in one of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon area with policymakers and decision makers from all backgrounds, all political backgrounds, to understand the impacts of fire. But it takes us to go there and sit there and discuss together on the ground, because I'm a true believer, like once you can see it and try to understand the concepts and the considerations and also the potential impacts from doing something or not doing something, or policy impacts, or funding impacts, or prioritization impacts. So I love it when, my kids, I always use my kids, they turn on the water and they're like, oh, they take it for granted. So actually I'm a big believer in going and seeing. So actually taking them up to the upper watersheds, hiked them up and said, okay, that drop of water that came from your faucet came from up here. So we have to take care of up there. We have to take care of the rivers and streams. We have to take care of our mountains and make those connections also to critical infrastructure as well.
Thanks, Annie and Phoebe. Appreciate those answers. A question from Dallas in the Q&A. What do you say to the private landowners that have devastating fires burn over their ground, but they don't want to partner with the government for funding?
Phoebe, you're in a good spot to answer that one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, Phoebe.
Okay. I've had a lot of, unfortunately, because we've had so many wildfires experience in that. And that's where I think, again, it helps to make those connections person to person. As you shared earlier, Autumn, it's devastating having to live through a wildfire, all the smoke, and it goes upon their land and devastates their land. So whether we're talking Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon in Mora and San Miguel, as well as down in Lincoln and Otero for this year, talking to property owners and also being able to listen, being able and having an open ear. I try my best. I'm not always perfect at it, but really also hearing their fears, hearing what they've had to live through, because there has to be that reciprocation of respectful listening. So if someone's not ready to understand and to hear, I also need to be respectful of that, because sometimes it's hard. Okay, now you've had a fire, now you've got to get ready for the floods. um and then the devastation to their property. This year, talking to folks down in Lincoln County, because they were devastated, and some of these properties have been in their family for generations, and they want it to be in their family for generations to come. And so when they see that devastation in the landscape and those old trees that have been burnt, or that bank that has been eroded, or that home that's been damaged by fire or flood, I also try to bring some long-term positivity and saying, yes, this happened immediately. We also need to talk about immediate life and property safety. And then also looking at the very long term, mid to long term recovery. Saying, yes, I understand in 2024, we've all lived with this devastating impacts, but how do we get from 2024 to 2034 so that it doesn't happen again, or that we can live in our property respective cabins or homes safely? So trying to kind of listen first and then start bridging that conversation about long-term, proactive, resilient measures that can be taken to make sure that that doesn't happen again, or to be safe, right? As we mitigate these changes in our environment.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Phoebe.